From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is Update One, the club's official podcast. It features newsworthy stories originating from the NPC facilities, as well as broader topics related to journalism, communications, press freedom, and transparency.
I'm Adam Konowe, and I'm joined today by Linda Tirado, winner of a National Press Club 2020 John Aubuchon Press Freedom Award. Linda recently visited the club to accept her award in person, and she joins me here. Welcome, Linda.
Hi, good to be here.
Thanks. You began covering American civil unrest, starting with the 2014 killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, as well as the 2016 armed occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon. What drew you to that beat?
It was absolutely accidental. I had just finished my first book in the spring of 2014, and it wasn't due to come out until October. So I was just hanging out in DC, and some activist friends of mine asked me, could I give them a ride out to St. Louis so that they could join the protests and drop off some supplies. And the next thing you know, a friend of mine had a mutual friend who was running a live stream, and his partner was targeted by police and shot at close range. It was in the clavicle with a beanbag, and he had a young child at home. So his wife just basically said, no, this is it. You're coming home now. And they were going to have to take the live stream down if they didn't have a warm body. So I wound up being a warm body. And the next thing you know, I was on location for 3 weeks and embedded with this group of homeless youths. And I became a journalist that covers civil unrest.
Fast forward to May 30th, 2020, you were covering the George Floyd protests on the street of Minneapolis as a freelance journalist and photographer. Before we talk about what happened to you there, can you talk a little bit about what brought you out on that occasion and what kind of coverage you were planning?
Sure. It was actually the first time I planned to work primarily as a photographer. Typically, I've worked as a on-the-ground reactive reporter. I do a lot of work that's primarily on Twitter of small clips and, hey, this is going on, this is going on. But this time I plan to be primarily a photographer. The reason that I went when I did was you have to remember that this was back at the beginning of coronavirus. So we had just gone into lockdown. In my line of work on my beat, there's it's a small community and we're from all over, but we tend to see each other and we, share resources, share rides, share hotel rooms, share batteries, all of those things, because most of us are freelance and independent. And so I started calling around in the way that we do of like, who's going, are you going? And just nobody could, either because they had a baby or they took care of elderly people or they were immunocompromised or just didn't feel like this story was worth the risk of, catching the plague, because this was when we were still microwaving mail and bleaching groceries and things like that. We had no idea, how it was spread or how lethal it was or, what the survival rates were. But you get feelings once you've done something for long enough. You can feel when something is electric and you can feel when something is going to need to be covered. And one thing that I do know, over the course of close to a decade of doing this is that if there is no press oversight, the civilian population tends to be more mistreated. And we had seen enough by Wednesday that I hopped in my car and got there on Thursday.
You were taking photos when a police officer aimed and fired his foam bullet gun directly at you. Where were you in relation to the police vis-a-vis the protesters? And do you think the police officer knew that you were part of the press and rather than a protester?
I think that it would be very difficult to look at somebody who was taking photos with a full frame camera and a full flash, very obviously taking news photos, and think, oh yeah, that's probably a protest leader, because most protesters, they might use a cell phone, and some of them will have small cameras or, small live streaming rigs, but I've never seen anybody out there with a Canon Mark IV and a full flash that's, out working as a protester. I think I had a press badge on. I've been doing this for a very long time, and you can tell who is moving in a professional way most of the time. There's just something about the way photographers work, kind of hunched, kind of walking back, kind of, taking rapid shots, things like that you wouldn't expect to see from a protester. And anybody who's been working in law enforcement or who's been covering protests for long enough, it's pretty easy to be like, oh, that's a photographer. But, again, the police had, the day before I got shot, arrested a CNN crew live on air, including, the anchor that was doing a stand-up and the guy with the huge shoulder mount camera. So I think that it's indisputable that the police, I don't think much cared if we were press. And in fact, may have targeted folks for being press. As to my disposition, when I first started, I was maybe 15 feet away from the police, facing the police. Protesters were behind me on the next block. So I don't know how familiar you are with protest dynamics, but typically what'll happen is you'll have a group of protesters and then you'll have a police line. And the police line will move forward, the protesters will drop back, and they tend to stay about half a block away from each other, half a block or a block in an urban scenario. They were about a block apart. I was in between them, facing the police, closer to the police, obviously taking photos of the police. I was backing away, which you can tell by just the series of photos that I took in the foreground lengthening, things like that. And you can obviously get that with the zoom, but you start taking photos, you back off, and when you hear that you're closer to protesters, you turn around and start taking photos, walking forward towards protesters. Or you do that in the opposite if you're starting at protesters. You back away, and then about halfway through, you swap and start taking photos of whatever you're walking towards. So that was about the scenario.
The non-lethal round struck you in the face, causing permanent blindness in one eye. What do you remember about that moment?
I remember a dull thud, and I remember thinking, that's not good. And I remember realizing that my goggles had come off because the tear gas hit my right eye. And I remember realizing that it was a bad sign that the tear gas didn't hit my left eye. I don't know if you've ever been in a bar fight or been hit in the face where you get like that big prize fighter's black eye and it immediately swells and you've got a black eye. Like that was the feeling. I had no idea how bad it was. I remember protesters came and the medics taped me up a little bit and they put me in a van and took me to the hospital. And I remember I was making all of these jokes about how I was going to have like this badass bruise, and everybody else was kind of like, sure, yeah, that's what it obviously looked a lot worse than it felt.
So you received some treatment there, sort of triage, and then were taken to the hospital, or what?
Yeah, I had my eyes, well, one of them was swollen, the other one was squeezed shut because obviously, it's weird because a lot of people thought I wasn't wearing goggles, or that was the assumption. And I don't know how you think a photographer goes out in tear gas and manages to take anything worthwhile without having goggles on. But I couldn't open my eyes, and somebody came and got me. And I remember they took my arm and said, okay, we're going to take you to the medics. And I don't know how long we walked or ran. Eventually they just put me down on a curb. They put water in my right eye and bandage on my left. And then they just put me in a van. And I remember the van ride. And then I got to the hospital and I realized that I had a tracking mark on my backpack, one of the green fluorescents. And then I posted a selfie to Twitter because I think I was just in shock at that point. I wasn't thinking terribly clearly, but I remember thinking everybody is going to be really worried if they don't hear from me. And Twitter is my mass communication. My husband reads my Twitter. All of my colleagues read my Twitter when I'm working. And so I just posted the selfie to Twitter and I said, it's fine, guys. I'm going into surgery. They're going to, see if they can save my eye, which in retrospect was not the least alarming way I could have put that. But I was just repeating what the doctor said. And then I woke up the next day and, the story had exploded while I was in surgery.
2020 NPC President Michael Friedman said that you, quote, exemplify the courage and tenacity at the heart of journalism, and that you also manifest the risks that journalists often face doing their jobs. How did you view that job before that fateful day in May 2020, and how do you look at it now?
If you get into a risky line of work, you either do it because you have no option, as in, the case of farm work or factory work or places where you have a lot of industrial accidents. Like, that's a question of livelihood and survival. If you get into the line of work that I did, if you enlist in the military, if you intentionally do go to places that are kinetic, where there are projectiles and angry people and violent situations, it's generally because you believe in it. Because somebody has to do it. In my case, I've always thought I have the skills. It takes a certain personality to be able to work in a crisis environment. It takes a certain personality and a certain amount of recklessness to be able to do that work. And I know plenty of really, really amazing journalists that would freeze. The fact that I don't kind of always made me think that I should be doing this because somebody has to, and I'm equipped.
You're a freelancer, and Angela Greeling-Kane, the then president of the NPC's Journalism Institute, the club's nonprofit affiliate, said that freelancers like you, quote, do their jobs bravely despite the fact that they often lack health insurance, legal help, or other protections that full-time employees are afforded. So how has being a freelancer impacted specifics related to your situation since May of 2020?
Well, to begin with, I don't have editorial oversight. So even when deciding how to tell the stories, which shots do I publicize, how do I do my job, in some pretty ethically sticky situations, even having an editor to go to, somebody with more experience, and say, how do I do this? In the most effective, most ethical way that protects people, but also exposes what needs exposure. That's been a big one for me. I was very lucky that Sidley Austin represented me pro bono, so I had plenty of legal advice. But I do know Will Sands, who did this remarkable photo essay of a lot of us that had lost an eye. He didn't have pro bono legal help. He had to figure out his lawsuit on his own, and plenty of people who had that same injury wound up with contingencies and wound up with, class actions and things of that nature. It's down to who your connections are and down to what kind of luck you have with your bad luck. My picture was running in China the next day. Like, it was worldwide. I got a lot of exposure, and a lot of attorneys reached out and were willing to help. The same goes with my medical care of I was able to, I had to pay it all out of pocket, obviously. But I was able to reach out to the hospital and say, look, this is the situation. I've got this lawsuit, and they deferred billing for me until the settlement came in. But even at that, that was easier for me to do, because when I walk into an ocularist office or I walk into an eye doctor's office and I go, oh yeah, I'm the journalist that got shot back in May in 2020, they go, oh, we know who you are. And so there's this kind of anti-celebrity that comes with some injuries, but not with others, and not to other freelancers in other situations. Like, I had already lectured at the London School of Economics when I got shot, so I'm in a very different position. I'm in, the top, call me the top 1% of freelancers as far as the resources that I have access to. But a lot of my colleagues don't have access to those. So I wind up doing a lot of fundraising for them, or a lot of boosting of their GoFundMes and things like that, because, somebody will have gotten hurt and then they can't work for 3 weeks, then they still have to make their rent. So it's those kind of knock-on effects of not having a newsroom and not having institutional protection.
Speaking of the lawsuit and the recent settlement, after that, the National Press Club came out with a statement in June that said that the issue of you potentially being targeted was not addressed in court because of the settlement. What's your take?
As to that, I'm going to have to let the settlement speak for itself. What I actually think is that there was no way that the city was ever going to admit guilt. I don't think we were ever going to hear that officer be like, oh yeah, I shot that bitch, and maybe if we had body cam footage, maybe we would have heard that. I don't know. But what I do know is that during the process of a lawsuit, any notes you take are potentially discoverable. And to tell a writer that you're going to put them through the most traumatic experience of their life and they can't write about it to process it. I couldn't write, I couldn't publish, I couldn't talk about it in public. I was essentially muzzled for 2 years after this incident. And at a certain point, we got enough assurances in the settlement of how they might be changing their practices. We did set a few precedents in the case already. And once we got those things, then it was just a question of money and a question of what would come out in the court record, most of which would have been redacted, or most of it which would have been kept confidential anyway. So to me at that point, I would rather get back to work.
I want to talk about that and the what comes out of the settlement. But was there catharsis when the settlement happened, or was it just another chapter in the saga?
Nah, it's one of those ends with a whimper kind of things. Like, nice to I was able to pay off my house, which is great in a coming recession. I was able to pay off my medical bills. There's a little bit of money in the bank. That's great. But for me, it really was about getting back to work and being able to speak to other people, to start doing research into police brutality and speaking about that again, because that had been my beat for years. And so then I'm stuck for 2 years. I'm in a recovery for the first probably 9 months. I was in physical recovery and wouldn't have been able to work anyway. And then the next year was spent largely processing, but I wanted to be working. I wanted to do my emotional processing through my work, and understand what happened to me and understand, how common is it? And maybe things that I hadn't realized because I hadn't been through the legal system, things like that. I don't want to make an eye joke, but it has given me a hell of a new perspective. And I think that that's the best thing to come out of it.
The press club statement went on to call for greater police training so that journalists engaged in covering protests like you are not intimidated or injured, whether deliberately or accidentally. What do you see as the path forward so that these two necessary institutions in our society can play their respective roles without fear?
Honestly, I think a lot of it's process. For example, I called up to Minneapolis before I went up there and I said, how do I get press credentials? And they didn't have them. So I had to wear just something that I had, like freelancers, we don't get credentials like that. We have to just kind of make up our own. And then it's down to an individual officer, if they ask to examine them, whether or not they, give us credit for having them or not. The reason freelancers mostly wear credentials is so that we'll be identified as members of the press from a distance. But our credentials aren't, backed by anybody for the most part. They're just like, I don't know, today I've made up my own media company. Why not? And I think that things like standardizing credentialing so that the police don't have to make a decision. Because the thing we have to remember is that the First Amendment does not make any particular distinction between members of the public and members of the press, but the press are mentioned specifically, right? So there's this room of you shouldn't be doing this to anybody. This is unconstitutional for you to do to anybody. But very specifically, we want to protect the press and in their role in oversight. And so things like having uniform policies of like every city should have to have a credentialing program and they should train their officers to recognize those credentials. It's like, no, they talked to us already. They're cleared. They're allowed to be there. Training officers in how to recognize how journalists work and how different journalists work. Because depending on what role I'm playing, if I'm a photographer, I'm obviously going to be, kind of out where I can see more things. But if I'm a writer, I'm working audio, I might be right in the middle of that crowd trying to get a solid audio or doing a lot of vox pops, things like that. So, different journalists with different capacities work differently, but here's what you can expect to see. As much as they do community outreach meetings, right, where they go out and they're like, you can ask us anything, we're not your enemy. Like, do that with journalists of like, okay, guys, here's the deal. I'm just doing my job. And I know you're just doing your job, but like my job and your job have us kind of adversarial, which does not make me your enemy. I'm out here to record a news event. I'm out here to record history. And that is my job. And your job is to keep the public safe. So when you are shooting at the public, I am going to record that because that is my job. In Ferguson, we got to know a lot of the cops and the National Guard guys because we just were there day in and day out, and they were working overtime and we were working overtime, and there was only one place to go pee or get coffee. So we would run into each other all the time. And there's this one guy who actually turned out to be pretty cool. And like every day we would pass each other at one point and he'd yell, "Hey, Tirado, you getting overtime today?" I'm like, "No, man, are you?" And he's like, "Yeah, better to be a cop, huh?" And it was that kind of like, poking fun, but very clearly, wasn't meant to be intimidating. He was taking the intimidation out of it with that kind of, rough humor that you get with soldiers and cops and firefighters and journalists, really, like a little bit of, and I think that things like that of people not thinking that the press is the enemy, because the other thing that happened is Donald Trump. And after years and years and years and years of being told the press is the enemy of the government, the press is the enemy of the police or the administration or whatever, a lot of people started to believe that. I thought Ferguson was going to be the worst I ever saw as far as police behavior. I could not believe what I saw in Minneapolis. Certainly they're different cities, but the other thing that happened was in between those two times, we had a president that told people that I was the enemy. They told police that I was the enemy for years.
Journalists often shun the limelight, and yet such notoriety has been thrust upon you. You talk about being known not just by lawyers who wanted to take your case, but you said eye doctors and other people like that. So now that this case is over, what's next for you? And can you go back to being that role of silent observer?
I think it's always been difficult for me because I actually started out with a viral essay and then became a memoirist, and then I became a journalist. And so for me, it's always been like, well, which hat am I wearing today? And I think I'm a lot more comfortable with that than a lot of straight news reporters are. Because I think we think about journalism often as just straight news reporting, but it can be opinion and it can be, first person, and it can be those things as long as you're honest with your audience about, what you're doing and how you're doing it. I think that there's a lot of value in that, because the best of journalism is explaining to people how other people have to live, or how other people get to live, or, how other people experience the world. And I think there's room for sports and for economic policy and for all of these things that go into a robust media. But, I've got a eye patch and blue hair. Like, how am I going to hide ever? Like, even if I just dyed my hair a normal color, a 40-year-old woman in a walker with an eye patch tends to attract some attention. A 40-year-old woman in a walker with an eye patch and a camera is just like blows people's minds. So I don't think I'm ever going to be unnoticed again, is I think the bigger issue for me is, because I used to be able to go places and maybe a few people would recognize me, maybe a few people would know me from, other work that I've done, but I didn't stand out. I was able to be in the back of a crowd and just kind of observe. And I think that is gone. And also, I'm not going to be able to work this beat anymore. I'd be a danger to myself and others running around in the dark with balance issues, not able to see the curb in front of me, So for me, figuring out what comes next is going to be the fun part. But whatever it is, it's going to be interesting.
And for those who come after you, those joining the profession or thinking of it, whether they're here or in the US or abroad, what would you tell them?
If you're not a little bit reckless and a little bit stupidly brave, find an office job. But if you are determined to physically uncover injustice that's happening in real time, then be careful about it. Be safe, have a partner, start with daytime things, get to know how things go before you find yourself, in tear gas at night in a kinetic situation. because there isn't a training path for the beat that I worked, but there are ways to get into it without jumping all the way in, because what you never, ever, ever want to do is be a risk to your colleagues or to the civilians around you. And it doesn't matter how comfortable you are. If you don't know what you're doing, you will be a danger to others. When I first started in Ferguson, I did jump in with both feet, and it was accidental. But Seth Richardson, who I believe is now with the Cleveland Plain Dealer, he does politics, he and I have photos of each other having just been tear gassed. And I got separated from my people, and I wound up having to, he very kindly let me sleep in the spare bed in his hotel room and use the shower. And that would have been a very bad situation if Seth hadn't been there. So, things like that will happen, but knowing how you're going to move and knowing how to move in those environments is really going to be key before you go out and start doing this work.
Linda, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Linda Tirado is a freelance journalist, photographer, and winner of an Aubuchon Press Freedom Award. You can follow her coverage on Twitter at Killer Martinis and Substack under the same handle. I'm Adam Konowe. Thanks again for listening.
You have been listening to Update One, the official podcast of the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists and a vigorous advocate of press freedom worldwide. If you have any questions or comments about Update One, send an email to updateonepodcast@gmail.com.